My name is Sienna Hansen, and at 35 years old, I am a lie. On Thanksgiving night, amidst the loud laughter in our Colorado cabin, my father, a respected retired Army colonel, raised his glass of bourbon. He looked straight at my younger brother, Connor, a Marine Corps major. Then his eyes dragged over me with absolute coldness. To Connor, he said, his voice echoing over the chatter. At least one of my children knows what real service to this country looks like. A son who brings honor, not a daughter who quit to work a pointless desk job. The entire room went dead silent. I felt the heat rush into my cheeks, but could only stare down at my cold plate of turkey, feeling as if I did not exist. They do not know that my desk job is a cover for missions my brother does not even have the clearance to read about. And tonight's insult was the final strike. They think I am weak, but they are about to face the real me. If you have ever felt invisible in your own family, if the words of your own blood have ever felt like a knife twisting in your chest, let me know where you are watching from. Hit the like button, because this story of hidden truth and reclaimed justice is exactly for you. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon-spiced pumpkin pie usually meant home. Tonight it smelled like a suffocating trap. Logs popped in the stone fireplace, throwing warm orange light across the rustic walls of our Colorado Springs cabin. I sat at the edge of the heavy oak dining table, the outsider. My $200 bottle of aged scotch sat pushed behind a stack of dirty serving platters on the kitchen counter, unopened and completely ignored. I kept my back straight, military posture ingrained deep in my bones, even while my cousins slouched in their chairs. I caught my father's eye across the table. "Dad, did you catch the Denver Broncos game on Sunday? Defense looked solid." He paused, his fork hovering, a tight forced nod. Then he physically turned his shoulders away from me. "Connor," he said, his voice warming instantly. "Tell me about those new mechanized infantry tactics your battalion is running out of Pendleton." My jaw locked. I took a slow, measured breath through my nose. It was not the silence that cut deep. It was the micro actions. The way they handed the gravy boat directly over my head. The way my aunt asked Connor about his deployment, but only asked me if my logistics office had good dental benefits. I was a ghost long before the military gave me the call sign. The clinking of silverware stopped when my father stood up. He tapped his butter knife against his crystal water glass. The ringing sound sliced through the low chatter. Everyone turned. Aunts, uncles, cousins. "Family," James Hansen began. He raised his glass. He spoke about legacy, the blood and sweat that built this nation. Then came the pivot, the deliberate, calculated strike. He looked at Connor. "To Connor, at least one of my children knows what real service to this country looks like. A son who brings honor." His eyes shifted. They landed on me, cold, hardened, disappointed. Not a daughter who quit to work a pointless desk job. The silence that followed was thick like wet concrete. Nobody moved. I stared at the congealed cranberry sauce on my plate. My throat tightened until swallowing felt like swallowing broken glass. The blood roared in my ears. I waited for someone to speak. Anyone. Connor shifted in his seat, looking mildly uncomfortable, but he took a sip of his beer and said absolutely nothing. He quietly accepted the praise built on my humiliation. Then I looked at my mother, Margaret Hansen. She was not angry. She looked at me with pity. She offered a sad, pathetic little smile. "Just take it, Sienna. You know how he is." That pity was the bullet that finally shattered the glass. I did not scream. I did not flip the table. Delta Force selection teaches you how to bury human reaction deep in the dirt and operate on pure ice. I placed my silver fork and knife down perfectly parallel on the edge of the china plate. I stood up. The wooden chair scraped loud and harsh against the hardwood floor. Every eye in the room darted to me. "Excuse me," I said. My voice was completely flat. "I am not feeling well." I walked down the hallway, grabbed my heavy wool coat from the rack, and pushed open the back door. The latch clicked shut behind me. The November air in Colorado does not just chill you, it bites. I walked down the wooden steps into the dark backyard. Before I reached the tree line, my mother's voice leaked through the frosted window panes. "Let her go, James. The girl is always so sensitive. She just cannot handle the pressure. My boots crunched against the freezing grass, sensitive. They threw a live grenade into my lap and blamed me for bleeding. I tilted my head back, looking up at the black sky scattered with sharp, indifferent stars. I did not feel the cold. I felt absolutely hollowed out. A deep, echoing void where my loyalty to that family used to be. Deep inside my coat pocket, my encrypted phone vibrated. A secure line. I pulled it out. The screen glowed a harsh, sterile white in the darkness. Ghost. Movement detected. Extraction needed. I stared at the glowing letters. I looked back over my shoulder at the cabin. The warm yellow light spilling from the windows looked fake now, like a cheap stage set. Inside that house, I was a failure. A fragile disappointment pushing papers at a desk. Outside this house, I was the shadow that kept monsters awake at night. I was the operator who pulled men out of hellfire. The brutal contrast snapped something inside my chest. The last remaining thread of a little girl seeking her father's approval snapped clean in half. I did not feel sad anymore. I felt dangerous. They wanted me to be a ghost. Fine, I will show them exactly what a ghost can do. My thumb hovered over the keypad. I typed 3 words, acknowledged, en route. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, turned my back on the cabin, and walked straight into the pitch-black tree line without making a single sound. The heavy steel door of my old Ford F-150 screamed on its rusted hinges as I pulled it shut. The sound echoed through the freezing Colorado woods. I turned the ignition. The engine sputtered, choked, and finally caught with a rough rumble. The heater was broken. It blew nothing but dead, icy air against my face. My hands gripped the cracked leather of the steering wheel. The cold seeped through my skin, settling deep into my bones. But I was used to the cold. My father taught me how to live in it. The dark pines blurred past the frosted windows as I merged onto Interstate 25. The rhythmic thumping of the tires against the asphalt felt like a metronome dragging my mind backward. It is funny how the brain works. A single moment of rejection can tear open decades of buried scars. West Point. Graduation day. The New York sun was brutally bright, glaring off the sea of gray uniforms and brass buttons. I stood at absolute attention. Top of my class in physical fitness. Academic honors. I pushed my body until I threw up in the dirt just to prove I belonged there. My father, James, walked up to me. He did not smile. He did not pull me into a hug. He placed one heavy, stiff hand on my shoulder. "Good work," he said, looking past me at the parade ground. "This is just the start. Do not disappoint me." That was it. No pride. Just an extension of his own ego. I was expected to be flawless. But 3 years later, when Connor barely scraped his way through Marine boot camp at Paris Island, the house smelled like smoked ribs and spilled beer for 2 days. My father bought 3 kegs. He slapped Connor on the back so hard it left a red mark. "That is my boy," he roared. For me, perfection was a baseline. For Connor, showing up was a victory. I pressed harder on the gas pedal. The truck engine whined. The heater rattled, still blowing ice. The unfairness was not born at West Point. It was planted much earlier. I was 10 years old. I came home from school dropping my backpack on the concrete porch. I ran to the chain-link fence in the backyard. Empty. Major, my German shepherd, was gone. He was clumsy, terrified of thunder, and loved to sleep at the foot of my bed. My father stood on the back porch, wiping engine grease off his hands with a dirty rag. "Where is Major?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Sent him to a farm out past Pueblo." My father said, not even looking at me. He would not follow orders. He was too soft for this house. I cried until my throat bled. I did not eat for 3 days, but my father never brought him back. That was the day the map of my life was drawn. It was a brutal, simple lesson. In the Hansen house, love was strictly conditional. If you were soft, if you were flawed, you were thrown away. You had to be made of iron. So, I became iron. And they hated me for it. The memory shifted. The smell of cheap lemon polish and stale coffee filled my nose. I was sitting on the floral sofa in my parents' living room. It was right after I passed selection for Delta Force. My left shoulder throbbed with a vicious burning pain. It was a real bullet wound from a classified op in the sandbox, hastily stitched up by a field medic. Blood was slowly seeping through the thick gauze under my flannel shirt. I sat perfectly straight, executing the approved cover story. "I am leaving the military," I said, staring at the coffee table. "I am taking a desk job in logistics." My father stopped breathing. The silence in the room was heavy enough to crush bone. He did not look at my pale face. He did not notice the stiff way I held my left arm. He stood up slowly, walked to the window, and stared out at the street. "I thought you were made of different material," he said. The disgust in his voice was raw and unfiltered. I was wrong. My mother buried her face in her hands and began to sob. Not because her daughter was in pain, not because her daughter looked exhausted. She cried because of the neighbors. "What are we supposed to tell people at the country club?" she wailed. "A desk job. After everything your father did to build this family's reputation." I swallowed the truth. I let them think I was a coward. I took their disgust, packed it into a tight box in my chest, and carried it for years. I bled for my country in shadows they could not even comprehend, just so they could sleep safely in their nice warm beds and call me a failure. I know I'm not the only one carrying this kind of weight. If you have ever sacrificed your own happiness or reputation to protect a family that only criticized you in return, I need you to know you are not alone. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below with a simple, "I know the feeling," or share a brief moment when you realized you were never going to be enough for them. It helps to know we are standing together. The dark stretch of the highway stretched out endlessly before me. The yellow dashed lines flashed by like a countdown. My hands gripped the cracked leather wheel so tight my knuckles turned a sharp bone white. The anger was no longer a slow burn. It was a violent, suffocating pressure in my chest. I slammed my right fist into the center of the steering wheel. The horn blared a harsh and desperate sound cutting through the empty Colorado night. My chest heaved. I stared at the dark road. I had given up my truth, my honor, and my peace for a family that viewed me as an embarrassment. "What did I do all of this for?" I whispered to the empty cab, my voice cracking against the cold glass. "To protect people who do not even respect me." The dashboard clock blinked 11:42 p.m. The black site was another 40 miles away. The world ahead of me was entirely pitch black, but the question kept screaming in my head louder than the rattling engine. Now what do I do? The fluorescent lights in the logistics office hummed with a cheap, vibrating buzz that drilled straight into the base of my skull. It was Tuesday morning. The air smelled of burnt breakroom coffee and stale printer ink. I sat in a gray fabric cubicle, my back perfectly straight against a chair that offered zero support. Gary, the regional supply manager, slapped a thick stack of manifests onto my desk. His belly pushed against the fabric of his cheap blue button-down shirt. "Sienna," he said, tapping the top page with a thick, sweaty finger. "I need these reconciled by tomorrow morning. No excuses." I did not blink. I just stared at the papers. Gary leaned in closer, his breath smelling like old onions and mints. "And do me a favor. Smile a little more, all right? Nobody likes working with a woman who always looks like she is marching to a funeral." My jaw tightened. My fingers curled around my plastic pen until the casing cracked slightly. I did not snap his finger backward, even though it would only take 1.5 seconds. I gave a single rigid nod. "Understood." 12 hours later, the humming of the office lights was replaced by the deafening roar of a Black Hawk rotor cutting through the hot, dry air. The smell of printer ink was replaced by the heavy metallic stench of cordite and burning diesel. I was 3,000 miles away, deep in the Middle East. Mud and sand caked my face. Sweat stung my eyes under my tactical helmet. I pressed the comms unit to my ear. "Viper 1, this is Ghost. Target compound is secure. Proceed to extraction point Bravo." My voice was not soft. It was not polite. It was a blade. The men on the other end of that radio did not ask me to smile. They executed my orders because they knew I was the only reason they were making it out alive. The whiplash between these two realities was a daily physical torture. In one world, I was a paper pusher, treated like a fragile secretary by a man who could not run a mile if his life depended on it. In the other, I held the lives of highly trained killers in the palm of my hand. Neither world belonged to me. That same brutal disconnect followed me back to Colorado. It was late Friday night. A bitter snowstorm was blowing across the Interstate 25 highway. My week was a blur of fake logistics reports and real covert satellite briefings. I was running on 3 hours of sleep. Suddenly, the engine of my Ford F-150 violently shuddered. A harsh grinding noise tore through the floorboards. The truck jerked to a dead stop on the icy shoulder. I slammed my fist against the steering wheel. Smoke poured from under the hood, smelling strongly of burnt transmission fluid. The temperature inside the cab dropped rapidly. I pulled my coat tighter around my neck. Normal people call their families when they break down in a winter storm. Normal people have a safety net. I pulled out my phone and scrolled past my father's name. If I called James, I would get a harsh lecture on proper vehicle maintenance and a heavy sigh of disappointment. If I called Connor, he would show up acting like a savior, full of arrogant advice about how I should have bought a different truck. I locked the screen. I called a local towing company. An hour later, I sat in the passenger seat of a rusted tow truck. The heater blasted hot, dry air smelling of old cigarettes. I handed the driver my credit card instantly, wiping out nearly $1,000 of my savings. I watched the red taillights of passing cars blur through the snowy windshield. The isolation sat heavy in my throat. Every single battle, from fixing a broken truck to surviving a firefight, was fought entirely alone. I closed my eyes against the glaring headlights passing by. I remembered standing on the parade ground at West Point years ago, listening to General Ann Dunwoody, the first female 4-star general in the Army. Her voice echoed in my head over the rumbling of the tow truck engine. "I never thought about being the first woman," she had said. "I only thought about being the best officer I could be." That quote was my anchor. It was the only thing keeping me from shattering. The sacrifices, the lonely nights on the side of a frozen highway, the mind-numbing desk job, the absolute lack of a single word of praise from my own father. All of it was the price of admission. I did not do this for their applause. I did it to be the absolute best operator in the shadows. I would endure it. It was past 2 a.m. when I finally unlocked the door to my apartment. The air inside was stale and freezing. I did not bother turning on the main overhead lights. I walked into the small kitchen, peeled the foil lid off a styrofoam cup of instant ramen, and filled it with tap water to heat in the microwave. Just a few days ago, my intelligence gathering led to the extraction of 20 hostages. Dozens of people were going back to their families because of me. Here, there was absolutely nobody. I sat at my small dining table in the dark. The only light came from the yellow street lamp outside the window. I laid out my black cleaning mat. I stripped my service rifle down to its core components. The metallic clicks and slides of the steel parts were the only sounds in the empty room. I wiped a lightly oiled rag over the bolt carrier. The cold metal reflected my blank, exhausted face. This was my victory. A silent room, a cheap cup of noodle soup, an oily rag. I set the upper receiver down on the mat. I looked around the dark, empty walls of my living room. They were not protecting me anymore. They were closing in. The silence of my apartment was loud. It pressed against my eardrums until I felt a physical ache. I grabbed my keys, threw on a faded denim jacket, and walked out. I needed noise. I needed the background static of ordinary life just to prove I was still part of it. I drove down to a local diner off Nevada Avenue. The air inside was heavy with the smell of burnt bacon and strong, cheap coffee. The bell above the door jingled. I found a small booth in the back corner facing the entrance. Old habits. I kept my back against the wall, scanning the room in under 3 seconds. A group of older men sat at a large table in the center. They were loud, laughing, arguing about sports, slapping the table. Every single one of them wore a worn baseball cap. Vietnam veteran, Desert Storm, USS Nimitz. It was a vet's coffee meetup, a Saturday morning ritual. I ordered a black coffee. I sat perfectly still, staring at the chipped formica table, letting their loud, rough voices wash over me. A shadow fell over my table. I looked up. An older man stood there. He had a thick silver beard, faded jeans, and a USMC gunnery sergeant pin on his denim collar. He held a ceramic mug of coffee in one hand. "Sorry to interrupt," he said. His voice was gravelly, worn down by years of shouting over engine noise or gunfire, but his eyes were surprisingly gentle. I am Frank. I gave a stiff defensive nod. I did not offer my name. I was just watching the way you sit. Frank continued pulling out the chair opposite me without asking. He sat down heavily. You check the exits. You sit straight. You keep your hands visible on the table. You served. It was not a question. It was a recognition. I felt my chest tighten. My own father looked at me and saw a failure. This stranger looked at my posture and saw a soldier. Army, I said, one word, flat and guarded. Frank nodded. He took a slow sip of his coffee. He did not ask what my rank was. He did not ask if I deployed. He did not ask why I was sitting alone in a diner on a Saturday morning. The hardest part is not the shooting, Frank said, staring down into his black coffee. People always think it is the shooting. It is not. He looked up at me. It is the quiet afterward. It is coming back and feeling like you are speaking a language nobody else in the room understands. You carry a rucksack full of rocks and everyone else is just complaining about the weather. I swallowed hard. The thick knot of tension in my neck, a knot that had been there for years, loosened by a fraction of an inch. I did not have to explain the classified missions or the body count. He already understood the weight. Before I could respond, the diner bell jingled again. A woman walked in. She was short with dark hair tied back, wearing a bright red sweater. She walked straight to our table and swatted Frank gently on the shoulder. Frank, you are bothering the poor girl, she said. Her accent was thick East Coast Italian-American. Frank chuckled. Maria, this is an Army veteran, just keeping her company. Maria looked at me. Her eyes were warm, taking in my rigid posture and the dark circles under my eyes. She did not see a threat. She saw someone who was tired. You look like you need a real meal, Maria said, crossing her arms. Not this diner trash. Sunday dinner, tomorrow, my house. I make the best homemade lasagna in Colorado Springs. Extra ricotta. I blinked. I cannot impose. I am. You are coming, Maria interrupted, pointing a firm finger at me. 1 o'clock. Do not be late. The next day, I parked my truck outside a small yellow house with a neatly trimmed lawn. I stood on the porch holding a bottle of cheap red wine, my heart pounding harder than it did during a nighttime halo jump. I knocked. The door opened, and the smell of garlic, roasting tomatoes, and melting cheese hit me like a physical wave. The house was small, cluttered, and incredibly warm. The contrast to the Hanson Thanksgiving was violent. There was no crystal glassware, no formal speeches about legacy. We ate off mismatched ceramic plates. Frank talked about his garden. Maria complained about the price of olive oil. They asked if I liked dogs. They asked if I preferred the mountains or the city. They listened. For 3 hours, I was not Ghost. I was not my father's disappointment. I was just Sienna. After dinner, Frank and I sat on the wooden back porch. The sun was setting behind Pikes Peak, painting the sky in deep, bruised purples and burnt oranges. I held a glass of sweet iced tea. The condensation dripped onto my jeans. The silence between us was not heavy or judging. It was just peaceful. When I finally stood up to leave, Maria walked me to my truck. She did not offer a stiff handshake. She pulled me into a tight, crushing hug. She smelled like basil and laundry detergent. You are a good girl, Sienna. Maria whispered, her hand patting my back firmly. The door to this house is always open for you, anytime you need it. I drove away from their house, feeling a strange, unfamiliar sensation in my chest. It felt light. For the first time in my adult life, the ice around my heart began to thaw. I had found a pocket of warmth in a freezing world. I rolled down my window, letting the cool Colorado night air hit my face, finally feeling like I could breathe. I pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex. I put the truck in park and turned off the engine. The absolute stillness of the night wrapped around me. I smiled in the dark. Then the silence shattered. My phone buzzed. The screen lit up the dark cabin of the truck. It was not a secure, encrypted line. It was my mother. I ignored the call that night in the truck. I let it ring out into the dark. But the ghost of my family did not give up easily. 3 days later, I was back at Frank and Maria's house. It was a Saturday afternoon. The Colorado sun was bright and sharp. I was in the backyard, my hands buried in dark potting soil, helping Frank move some heavy ceramic planters. Maria was in the kitchen, and the smell of roasting garlic drifted through the open window. For a few hours, the tight knot of anxiety in my chest was gone. I was just a person doing manual labor in the dirt, breathing clean air. Then my phone rang. I wiped the dirt off my hands onto my jeans and pulled it out of my back pocket. The caller ID flashed Margaret Hansen. I stared at the screen. My jaw tightened. The peacefulness of the backyard evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, familiar dread. Frank stopped digging. He looked at my face, then down at the ringing phone. He did not say a word. He just picked up his shovel and walked to the far corner of the yard, giving me space. I pressed the green button. Sienna, sweetheart. How are you doing? The voice on the other end was unnaturally sweet. It was covered in sugar, hiding the poison underneath. My mother never called just to ask how I was doing. That tone was an alarm bell. It was the sound she made right before she asked for something. I am fine, Mom, I said. My voice was flat, guarded. Oh, good. Listen, she said, her tone dropping the fake sweetness and moving straight to business. Connor is applying for that joint tactical screening program at Fort Bragg. It is extremely competitive, very few spots. My grip on the phone tightened. I knew exactly what that program was. I had helped design the infiltration parameters for it 2 years ago. Here is your father, she said abruptly. The line clicked. The heavy, commanding voice of James Hansen filled my ear. He did not say hello. Sienna, your mother told you about Connor. I hear your logistics company works with a few defense contractors out that way. I stopped breathing. The sheer blinding hypocrisy of his words hit me like a physical blow. Just weeks ago at the Thanksgiving table, he had publicly humiliated me. He had looked at me with pure disgust and called my work a pointless desk job. Now he wanted to use that exact same job to pull strings for his golden boy. I am a supply manager, Dad, I said, keeping my voice dangerously even. I do not have influence over military selections. Do not play stupid with me, James snapped. The polite mask slipped instantly. I know how the real world works. You have contacts. You talk to the people moving the gear. You make a phone call, you drop a word to the right contractor, and you make sure Connor's file gets pushed to the top of the pile. Consider it your way of contributing to this family. Contributing. As if bleeding out in the dirt of a foreign country was not enough. As if taking their insults with a bowed head for a decade was not enough. He wanted me to rig a military selection process, a process I respected for a brother who had never once stood up for me. Dad, that is not how it works. That is against protocol. The line clicked again. My mother had grabbed the phone. The tears were already starting. The guilt card was in play. Sienna, how can you say that? This is your brother's future, she wailed. Her voice was shrill, designed to pierce straight through my defenses. Can you not just do this one thing for the family? After everything we have done for you, you are being completely selfish. Then James's voice rumbled in the background, cold and sharp as a razor. Stop acting like you have a moral high ground. We all know what kind of paper-pushing work you do. Make the call. Do not disappoint this family again. They had me pinned against a wall. They were using my manufactured shame as a weapon. They were not asking for a favor. They were demanding obedience. If I refused, I was the villain. If I agreed, I was their tool. I looked at the dirt under my fingernails. I was exhausted. The years of fighting this exact same psychological war suddenly felt entirely too heavy to carry for another minute. I just wanted the ringing in my ears to stop. Fine, I said mechanically. I will see what I can do. Good girl. My mother chirped, the tears vanishing instantly. Talk to you soon. The line went dead. I stood in the bright sunlight, staring at the black screen of my phone. My hands began to shake, not from fear, from a rage so cold it burned. Frank walked back over. He leaned on his shovel. He did not ask what they wanted. He looked at my white knuckles and the rigid line of my shoulders. He placed one thick, calloused hand on my shoulder. You do not owe anyone a damn thing, kid, Frank said quietly, especially your own peace of mind. The simple truth of his words broke the dam. I did not cry out of sadness. I cried out of pure, unadulterated anger. A single tear tracked through the dust on my cheek. I realized then that they were never going to change. They would never see me as a daughter. I was a scapegoat when they needed someone to blame, and a tool when they needed someone to use. I wiped the tear away roughly with the back of my dirty hand. I looked down at the phone. I had spent my entire life trying to earn a seat at their table. It was time to flip the table over. I turned my phone completely off. I walked toward my truck. I was not going to make a phone call for Connor. I was going to build a weapon. 2 weeks later, the phone rang again. This time, I did not ignore it. Sienna. My mother's voice was bright. Too bright. Connor got into the tactical screening program. We are so proud. We are having a celebration dinner this Saturday at the Penrose Room. And we want to thank you for your help. You simply must come. Thank you. 2 words I had chased for 35 years. A pathetic, fragile spark of hope flared in my chest. I hated myself for it. I hated that a simple invitation could make me forget the manipulation. But I agreed. I even bought a dark blue evening dress. I never wore dresses. I spent $300 just to look like I belonged to them. Saturday night. The Broadmoor Hotel in Colorado Springs. The Penrose Room was suffocatingly expensive. Heavy crystal chandeliers threw harsh, glittering light over white linen tablecloths. The air smelled of roasted garlic, expensive wine, and old money. I walked to the private dining area. I stopped dead in my tracks. It was not a family dinner. It was a networking event. My parents sat at the head of a long table. Connor sat to their right, wearing a tailored suit. Surrounding them were defense contractors, local politicians, and 2 retired Army generals my father knew. I was directed to an empty chair at the far end of the table, next to a junior logistics officer I did not even know. I sat down. I smoothed the dark blue fabric over my knees. The trap snapped shut. The dinner dragged on. Waiters in white coats poured endless glasses of Cabernet. Filet mignon was served on gold-rimmed plates. Every toast, every laugh, every handshake was directed at Connor. I was a ghost at the end of the table. Then my mother leaned forward, smiling at a defense contractor across from her. Oh, we are just so blessed, Margaret said, her voice carrying over the clinking silver. Connor worked so hard, and it was lucky Sienna was there to help out with some of the logistics paperwork. You know how those supply offices are. Paperwork. She reduced a massive classified operation to filing papers. The contractor offered a tight, polite smile in my direction and immediately went back to praising Connor. I was a prop. A minor footnote in my brother's manufactured success story. Dessert arrived. My father stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket. He tapped his spoon against his crystal glass. The room went dead silent. Tradition. James Hansen began. His voice was deep, projecting across the room like he was briefing a battalion. Tradition is the blood of this country. The Hansen family has bled for that tradition. He reached into his breast pocket. He pulled out a small, faded blue velvet box. My lungs stopped pulling in air. I knew that box. This, my father said, opening the lid. The chandeliers caught the dull gold of the heavy ring inside. This is my father's West Point graduation ring. He wore it in Korea. I wore mine in Desert Storm. It belongs to the person most worthy of carrying the Hansen legacy forward. My hands gripped the edge of the table. The wood dug into my palms. I graduated at the top of my class at West Point. Connor did not even go to the academy. By every rule of military tradition and family blood, that ring belonged to me. James walked past my chair. He did not even look down. He stopped behind Connor and placed the heavy gold ring on the table next to my brother's coffee cup. Wear it with pride, son, James said, his voice thick with emotion. A true Marine, a true leader. The applause broke out around the table. Connor grinned and picked up the ring. The fragile spark of hope inside my chest did not just die. It froze into a solid, jagged block of ice. The years of biting my tongue, the years of protecting their fragile egos, The years of hiding my scars, it all ended right there. I stood up. The scrape of my chair against the hardwood floor was sharp. It cut through the applause. The clapping died down. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me. I did not yell. I did not cry. I channeled the exact tone I used when calling in an airstrike. Cold, flat, absolute. Congratulations, Connor, I said. My voice carried clearly across the quiet room. I looked straight into my father's eyes. He frowned, his jaw tightening. You are right, Dad, I said. That ring belongs to the person carrying the family legacy. And tonight I finally understand that I am not a part of that legacy. And I do not want to be. Margaret gasped. Sienna, sit down. You are making a scene. I did not look at her. I kept my eyes locked on James. Thank you for making things perfectly clear. This is my last dinner at this table. I picked up my white linen napkin. I folded it into a perfect sharp square. I placed it in the center of my plate. I turned my back on the entire room and walked out. I kept my spine completely straight. I did not walk fast. I did not look back. If you have ever reached your absolute breaking point, if you know exactly what it feels like to finally walk away from a toxic table, I need you to stand with me right now. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below and just type, I walked away. So I know I'm not the only one who had to leave their own blood behind to find peace. The freezing night air hit my face as I stepped out the heavy glass doors of the Broadmoor. The valet attendant rushed forward, but I waved him off. I walked past the line of luxury cars, my heels clicking sharply against the frozen asphalt. I reached my old battered Ford truck in the back lot. I unlocked the heavy door and climbed into the freezing cab. I did not turn the key. I sat in the dark. They wanted a logistics clerk. They wanted a paper pusher. I reached into the center console and pulled out my encrypted satellite phone. The green light blinked in the dark. I was done being the victim. It was time to show them the real monster they created. I did not drive back to my apartment. I steered the heavy Ford F-15 up the winding mountain roads until I reached an overlook high above Colorado Springs. I parked on the gravel shoulder. I killed the engine. The city lights spread out below me like a grid of orange and white fire. My breathing was slow and even. The explosive, blinding anger from the dining room had completely burned off. What replaced it was far more dangerous. It was a cold, absolute clarity. For a decade, I operated as a ghost. I planned covert extractions in hostile territories. I neutralized threats before they even knew they were being hunted. I did it all in the dark to protect people in the light. Now I was the target. My family was the hostile territory, and the weapon they used against me was a lie. I popped the glove box. I pulled out a small weather-beaten tactical notebook and a black pen. I laid it on the center console. I did not want revenge. Revenge is sloppy. Revenge is driven by emotion. I wanted total destruction of their narrative. I wanted the truth. I clicked the pen. I started writing. Objective liberation. Target James Hansen. Weapon undeniable authority. I mapped out the operational phases. I outlined the risks. I anticipated counterattacks. I treated the destruction of my father's ego exactly like a high-value target mission. When I finished, the ink on the page was dark and jagged. I stared at the plan. It was flawless, but it required pulling a trigger I had sworn never to touch. I closed the notebook. I started the truck. 30 minutes later, I stood on Frank's front porch. It was past midnight. I knocked 3 times. The door opened. Frank stood there in a faded gray t-shirt and flannel pajama pants. He did not look surprised to see me. He took one look at my dark blue evening dress and the hard, flat look in my eyes. "Come in," he said. I sat at his small kitchen table. The house was quiet. Maria was asleep upstairs. Frank turned on the coffee maker. The smell of dark roast coffee filled the tight space. I did not tell him about Delta Force. I did not tell him about the classified deployments or the kill counts. I told him about the ring. I told him about the dinner. I told him about the lie. "They threw me away for the last time, Frank," I said. My voice was completely hollow. "I am ending it." Frank did not offer me a useless platitude. He did not tell me that family is complicated. He poured 2 mugs of black coffee and set one in front of me. He sat down heavily in the chair across from me. He leaned forward, resting his thick forearms on the table. He looked at me not as a broken daughter, but as a soldier. "So," Frank said, his gravelly voice dropping an octave, "what is the mission, warrior?" I looked at him. That simple sentence grounded me. He did not need to know the details. He just needed to know I had a plan, and he was ready to back my play. "I am burning the house down," I said, "and I need to make sure they cannot rebuild it." Frank nodded once. "Let me know where to stand." I left his house an hour later. The sky was beginning to turn a bruised, dark gray. I drove back to my apartment and locked the door behind me. I sat on the edge of my mattress. I stared at the blank white wall opposite my bed. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a cold, creeping dread in my stomach. The plan I wrote in the truck was a massive security violation. If I brought classified information into a civilian space, even without revealing state secrets, I risked my career. I could face an inquiry. I could be discharged. I could lose the only identity I actually cared about. I rubbed my face with both hands. The silence in the room was crushing. I remembered a video I watched on my laptop during a long layover in a military hangar in Germany. It was a talk by Brené Brown. Vulnerability is not winning or losing. It is having the courage to show up and be seen when we have no control over the outcome. The quote hit me like a physical punch. I had spent my entire adult life hiding. I hid behind a logistics desk. I hid behind the call sign, Ghost. I hid my physical scars and I hid my emotional ones. I thought the secrecy made me strong. It did not. It just made me easy to erase. If I wanted to destroy the lie, I had to stop hiding. I had to step into the light and let them look directly at me, even if it cost me the uniform. I stood up. I walked to my tactical gear bag sitting in the corner. I unzipped the side pocket and pulled out my encrypted satellite phone. I powered it on. The green light illuminated my dark room. I scrolled through the restricted contact list. I passed field commanders. I passed intel analysts. I stopped at a name near the top. General Harper. He was a 4-star general now, chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He was also the man who personally selected me for Delta Force a decade ago. He knew exactly what the Ghost was worth. My thumb hovered over the call button. My hand trembled slightly. This was the point of no return. Pushing this button was the equivalent of pulling the pin on a flashbang and dropping it in my father's living room. I took a deep breath through my nose. I tightened my grip on the phone. I pressed call. The line clicked twice. A deep, authoritative voice answered immediately. "Harper." "General." I said, my voice ice cold. "This is Ghost. I need your help." I called a family emergency meeting for Tuesday evening at their house. I told them it was about my future employment. I arrived 10 minutes early. I sat in the center of their leather sofa. I wore my dark gray civilian suit. No makeup, no jewelry. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting loosely on my knees. I did not check my phone. I did not look around. I just waited. At exactly 7 o'clock, my father, James, walked into the living room. Connor followed close behind. James had a look of absolute smug satisfaction plastered across his face. He thought he had won. He thought my dramatic exit from the Broadmoor was just a tantrum, and now the prodigal daughter was returning to beg for forgiveness. He probably assumed I was there to ask for help keeping my logistics job, or to finally agree to pull strings for Connor. Connor slouched against the doorframe, crossing his arms. He wore a tight t-shirt to show off his marine physique. He smirked. Margaret hovered near the kitchen archway, twisting a dish towel in her hands. She looked nervous, ready to play the peacemaker and secure my obedience. James walked to the leather armchair opposite me. He did not sit down immediately. He stood tall, looking down his nose at me. "So," James began, his voice dripping with condescension, "why did you call us here, Sienna? Are you finally ready to act like an adult? Because walking out of a dinner like that was entirely unacceptable." I did not answer. I just stared at him. The air in the room was thick, suffocating with their shared arrogance. "Do not ignore your father," Margaret piped up from the kitchen. "He's just trying to help you sort out your career issues." I kept my eyes locked on James. The silence stretched. It was a tactical silence. I let them sit in it until Connor scoffed and shifted his weight. Before James could open his mouth to deliver another lecture, a sharp, piercing sound cut through the heavy air. The front doorbell rang. James frowned. He looked at his watch. "Are you expecting someone else? Who did you invite to this house?" I stood up slowly. I walked past James. I did not say a word. I opened the heavy wooden front door. The crisp evening air rushed in. General Harper stepped over the threshold. He was not in civilian clothes. He was in his full Army service uniform. The dark blue fabric was immaculate. The gold braids gleamed. The 4 silver stars on his epaulets caught the warm living room light and reflected it back like polished knives. His chest was covered in a heavy block of ribbons and combat medals. He looked exactly like what he was, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Absolute, unquestionable authority. The air vanished from the living room. James Hansen, a retired 06 colonel, reacted before his brain could even process the information. It was pure, ingrained muscle memory. He snapped his heels together. His spine locked bone straight. He stood at rigid, terrified attention in the middle of his own living room. Connor pushed himself off the doorframe. His mouth literally fell open. His eyes were wide, fixed completely on the 4 stars on Harper's shoulders. He froze, unsure whether to salute or drop to the floor. General Harper did not look at them. He walked past James as if he were a piece of furniture. He stopped in front of me. "Colonel Hansen," General Harper said. His voice was a deep, gravelly rumble that rattled the picture frames on the walls. James flinched. The word colonel hit him like a physical strike to the jaw. Harper extended his hand. I took it. He offered a firm, deeply respectful shake. "Thank you for the invitation, Sieni," Harper said. Then Harper turned around. He looked at James. James was still standing at attention, his face draining of all color. He looked old, suddenly incredibly old. "Stand down, James," Harper commanded quietly. James relaxed his stance slightly, but he did not move. He was trembling. "I am here in a personal capacity," Harper said, his voice easily commanding the space. "I was asked to stop by from one of the finest, most lethal officers I have ever had the privilege to command." Harper did not talk about classified logistics. He did not mention the Middle East or Delta Force. He did not need to. "There are soldiers who wear their service loudly." Harper said, his cold eyes fixed on James. "They wear the rings. They take the applause at fancy dinners. And then there are the operators who do the real heavy lifting, the ones who go into the dark so the rest of us can sleep. We have a name for the best of them. We call them ghosts." Connor let out a sharp, choked gasp. He looked at me, sheer terror and awe warring on his face. Harper took one step closer to James. He lowered his voice, making the words cut even deeper. "A soldier's legacy is not the brass on his collar or the ring on his finger, James," Harper said. "It is the blood they are willing to spill when no one is watching. Your daughter has sacrificed more for this country than you and I put together. The United States owes her a debt it can never repay. Do not ever mistake her silence for weakness again." Harper did not wait for a response. He turned back to me, offered one crisp, perfect salute, which I returned, and walked out the door. The latch clicked shut. The silence left behind was absolute devastation. James Hansen collapsed into the leather armchair. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire religion burn to the ground. His hands shook violently. Margaret covered her mouth. She started to cry loud, ugly sobs of pure shame. Connor stared at me. He looked like a frightened child. "Ghost!" He whispered, his voice cracking. You are the ghost." I did not smile. I did not gloat. I stood perfectly still, looking down at the ruins of my father's ego. "Can we have a fair conversation now? Colonel Wakwan's—" The days following General Harper's visit felt like standing in the middle of a blast radius. The initial shockwave had passed, but the air was still thick with dust and debris. My phone blew up. Margaret called 6 times the first morning. I let them all go to voicemail. Her messages were frantic, filled with wet, jagged sobs. She apologized for everything. She apologized for nothing specific, just noise. Connor sent long, rambling text messages. He did not ask for a favor anymore. He sounded like a kid who just realized his older sister was an astronaut. But the one person I actually waited for was silent. James did not call. That silence was a familiar ache. Even after being publicly stripped of his arrogance by a four-star general, the old man still could not figure out how to navigate his own pride. The truth was out, but the cowardice remained. A week later, my phone vibrated. A single text from James. Meet me at Garden of the Gods, the bench near the balanced rock. I drove out there the next afternoon. The Colorado sun beat down, baking the massive jagged slabs of red sandstone. The sky was an impossible sharp blue. I found him sitting on a weathered wooden bench staring out at the rocky formations. He wore a faded army jacket. He looked smaller. The rigid, overbearing colonel from the dining table was gone. I sat down on the far edge of the bench. I kept a foot of space between us. I did not look at him. I looked at the red rocks. We sat in silence for 5 full minutes. I was wrong, James finally said. His voice was not a roar. It was a raspy, hollow croak. He did not look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. There is no excuse. He continued the words, sounding like they physically hurt his throat to push out. I drove you into the ground because you were tougher than me, and I resented it. I have been a terrible father. I listened to the wind cutting through the sparse pine trees. I had spent 35 years fantasizing about this exact moment. I thought hearing him admit fault would feel like a parade. I thought it would feel like a heavy door swinging open. It did not. It just felt incredibly sad. I looked at his graying hair and the deep lines around his mouth. The invincible, terrifying giant of my childhood was dead. He was just a flawed, insecure old man who broke his own family to protect his ego. I had won the war, but the battlefield was a graveyard. I took a slow, deep breath. I hear you, Dad, I said. My voice was calm. It did not shake. And I appreciate you saying it. He finally turned his head to look at me. There was a desperate, hungry look in his eyes. He wanted absolution. He wanted me to tell him it was okay. I did not give it to him. But you need to understand something, I said, meeting his gaze directly. The daughter who chased your approval is gone. She died in that restaurant the night you gave Connor the ring. I am not angry anymore. I am just done carrying your weight. James swallowed hard. He nodded slowly. If we are going to have any kind of relationship moving forward, I said, my tone shifting to the same flat, tactical cadence I used in briefings. It starts from scratch, ground zero. It operates on respect, not expectations. And it operates entirely on my terms. He did not argue. He did not pull rank. He just looked at his hands and nodded again. Understood, he whispered. I stood up. I did not hug him. I left him sitting on the bench and walked back to my truck. I felt lighter. The anger was gone, replaced by a cold, solid boundary. The next evening, there was a knock on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole. It was Connor. He wore a plain gray hoodie and jeans. He held 2 cardboard cups of coffee from a cheap gas station. I opened the door. I did not invite him in immediately. I brought black coffee, Connor said, holding out a cup. He looked awkward, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Can I come in? I stepped aside. He walked into my small living room, looking around at the bare walls and the single armchair. He set the coffee on the small table. He did not offer an explosive crying apology like Margaret. He did not offer a formal surrender like James. He sat down on the edge of the cheap sofa. I do not want to talk about the deployments, Connor said quietly, looking at his boots. I do not want to know the classified stuff. I do not care about the medals. He looked up at me. The arrogance that usually defined his Marine persona was completely gone. I just want to know what it was like for you, he said. Because I realize now I never actually looked at you. I just took the praise and let you take the hits. Talk to me, Sienna. Tell me how it actually felt. I sat down in the armchair across from him. I held the warm cardboard cup in my hands. For the first time in our entire lives, we were not competing. We were not the golden boy and the scapegoat. We were just 2 adults sitting in a cheap apartment trying to dig out of the rubble our parents created. I took a sip of the bitter coffee. I started to talk. I told him about the isolation. I told him about the freezing night in the broken Ford F-150. I told him about the silence of the empty apartment. He did not interrupt. He just listened. For 2 hours, the wall between us slowly crumbled into dust. When he finally left, I stood in the doorway and watched him walk down the hallway. I closed the door and locked the deadbolt. I walked over to the small trash can in the kitchen. I reached into my pocket. I pulled out a crumpled, glossy photo from the Thanksgiving dinner. It showed James, Margaret, and Connor smiling. I was standing in the background, out of focus. I dropped the photo into the trash. I did not look back at it. I pulled out my phone and dialed Frank's number. He picked up on the second ring. "Hey, kid," Frank said. "Frank," I said, a genuine quiet smile pulling at the corner of my mouth. "Are you and Maria busy tomorrow? I need someone to help me look at houses. I am moving." "We will be there at 9, he said. I hung up. The apartment was still quiet, but it did not feel empty anymore. I stared at the dark reflection of my face in my phone screen. 7 years is a massive amount of time in the military. It is enough time to burn a life to the ground and build a completely new one from the ashes. I was 42 years old. I wore the rank of Major General. The thick, humid air of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, pressed heavy against my dark green utility uniform as I walked across the cracked asphalt staging area. The sharp smell of pine needles and hot diesel fuel hung in the morning air. A young female captain walked quickly beside me, trying to match my stride. Her jaw was locked tight. Her hands were balled into rigid fists at her sides. She looked exactly like I did a decade ago. Angry. Guarded. Trying to prove she belonged in a briefing room full of men who desperately wanted her to fail. I stopped walking. I turned and looked her dead in the eye. "You do not need to out-yell them, Captain," I said, keeping my voice low, flat, and steady. "You just need to outlast them. Do the work. The respect will follow the results." Her stiff shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. She swallowed hard and gave a sharp nod. "Understood, ma'am." I became the mentor I never had. I refused to pass the damage down the line. My phone buzzed in my cargo pocket. I pulled it out. "James Hansen," I answered on the second ring. He did not bark orders anymore. He called to ask my opinion on a complex defense logistics bill moving through the Senate. He actually listened when I spoke. The power dynamic had completely flipped, anchored by cold, hard boundaries. November rolled around. Thanksgiving. But this time the battlefield was my territory. My house in North Carolina. The smell of roasting turkey mixed heavily with the sharp, rich scent of garlic-baked ricotta and simmering tomato sauce. Maria absolutely insisted on bringing her homemade lasagna. She and Frank sat right at the center of my long wooden dining table. Frank wore a pressed button-down shirt. Maria wore a bright yellow dress. They were the guests of honor. My parents and Connor sat directly across from them. There was no suffocating tension. There were no snide passive-aggressive remarks hiding behind fake smiles. The air was not thick with unsaid insults. It was just loud, normal, chaotic family noise. Connor was talking to Frank about the torque on heavy diesel engine blocks. Margaret was leaning over earnestly asking Maria for the exact measurements in her pasta recipe. I sat at the head of the table. I held a glass of ice water. I watched them. I did not have to hide my scars, physical or mental, anymore. James stood up. The scraping of his chair made the room go quiet. It was not the terrified walking on eggshells silence of the past. It was respectful. He picked up his heavy glass of amber bourbon. His hand shook slightly. The years had finally softened his hard, cruel edges. "To my daughter," James said. His voice was thick with raw emotion. He looked directly across the table at me. "Major General Sienna Hansen, you taught me the hardest, most painful lesson of my life. You taught me what real honor and real courage actually look like. I am so damn proud of you, Sienna." He raised his glass. The rest of the table followed without hesitation. I looked at the amber liquid catching the light in his glass. Those exact words used to be the only thing I wanted in the entire world. Now they did not define me. They did not fix the past, but they were true. And that was enough to let the resentment go. The next morning was the official promotion ceremony. I stood alone in the small sterile ready room just off the main auditorium. The faint hum of the crowd murmured through the heavy wooden door. I stared at my reflection in the full-length mirror. The dark blue Army service uniform fit perfectly across my shoulders. I held the two heavy silver stars in my open palm. The metal was ice cold against my skin. I closed my eyes. I thought about the serenity prayer. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference. It was not just a cheap quote painted on a wall. It was the exact tactical map of my survival. I could not change the brutal coldness of my childhood. I could not change the dog my father gave away or the gold ring he handed to my brother. I accepted that permanent damage. But I had the courage to change the present. I burned the old toxic house down and built a new one entirely on my own terms. The wisdom was finally knowing that peace was a choice, not a reward. I walked out onto the wooden stage. The massive auditorium was packed. Flashbulbs went off in rapid succession, blinding white against the dark room. General Harper, now retired and wearing a sharp-tailored gray suit, stood waiting for me at the center. I stood at absolute attention. Harper stepped forward. He pressed the heavy silver stars into the dark shoulder boards of my uniform. His heavy hands patted my shoulders firmly. He leaned in, close, smelling of peppermint and old leather. "The whole world sees you now, ghost," Harper whispered. I gave a short, crisp nod. I turned around to face the massive crowd. But I did not look at the endless sea of green and blue uniforms. I looked straight down at the front row. James sat there, his chest puffed out with genuine, unforced pride. Margaret smiled openly, wiping a happy tear from her cheek. Connor gave me a sharp, respectful nod. Right next to them, Frank grinned broadly through his silver beard, and Maria blew me a kiss. That was my world. In that exact second, I was no longer the ghost hiding in the shadows of a classified war. I was no longer the scapegoat begging for scraps of conditional love. I was Sienna. I was seen. I was loved. And I was completely free. Please hit the like button, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel if this story moved you. Thank you for listening to my journey, and I will see you next time.